For centuries, humanity lived in shadow, relying on the flickering, smoky light of tallow or the rare, pure glow of beeswax. We sailed stormy seas.
In December of 1673, in a farmhouse in rural England, a family finished their evening meal just as the last gray light disappeared from the windows, somewhere around 4 in the afternoon. And then, for the next 14 hours until the sun rose again the following morning, they simply sat in the dark, not because they chose to. Because a single tallow candle, the cheapest form of household lighting available to an ordinary family, cost roughly what a laborer earned in half a day of work, and burning even 2 or 3 of them through a long winter evening could represent a meaningful fraction of a family's weekly income. So most nights, they didn't. They banked the fire, they went to bed early, and an enormous portion of their waking lives simply vanished into darkness, not by choice, but because light itself was a luxury item, rationed out candle stub by candle stub for almost the entirety of human history. It is difficult for anyone alive today, in a world where flipping a switch produces instant, free, unlimited light, to genuinely grasp just how much darkness shaped daily life for nearly every human being who ever lived before the last 150 years or so. Winter evenings were not simply darker, they were functionally empty hours, stretches of time in which almost nothing productive could safely happen, and this single fact, the raw expense and scarcity of artificial light, quietly dictated when people worked, when they slept, what they could learn, and even in many documented cases whether they lived or died. If stories like this pull you in, hit subscribe now, because we are about to walk through one of the least discussed forces in human history, an invisible tax on time itself that shaped civilization for thousands of years before anyone thought to question it. For most of human history, once the sun went down, your options for light were extremely limited, extremely expensive, or both. The open hearth fire, the same fire responsible for so much of the danger and labor of cooking, also served as the primary source of household light for the poorest families across nearly every culture on Earth. Firelight is dim, uneven, and confined to a single room, but it was free in the sense that it came bundled with the fire already being used for warmth and cooking. And for families who could afford nothing else, it was often the only light they would see indoors after dark for their entire lives. For anything beyond firelight, for actual portable, directable illumination, people turned to a narrow range of technologies that had barely changed in thousands of years. The rushlight, one of the oldest and cheapest forms of artificial lighting, was made by peeling the outer layer from the pith of a common marsh rush and soaking the exposed core in animal fat, usually whatever kitchen grease or tallow happened to be available. Once dried, this simple object could be held in a small metal clip and lit at one end, producing a weak, flickering flame that burned for perhaps 20 to 30 minutes before needing to be replaced or repositioned. A single rushlight produced barely enough light to see your hand in front of your face, let alone read by, and yet for enormous numbers of rural poor across Europe, this was the primary source of directable light available to them for centuries, right up through the early 1800s in some of the poorest communities. Tallow candles made from rendered animal fat, usually beef or mutton fat, represented a step up from the rushlight, burning longer and somewhat brighter, but they came with their own significant drawbacks. Tallow candles produced a thick, acrid smoke and an unmistakably unpleasant smell as the fat burned, something akin to the smell of meat left too long on a hot pan, filling small, poorly ventilated rooms with a haze that stung the eyes and coated the lungs in exactly the same way that cooking smoke did. They also required near constant attention, because unlike modern candles, tallow candles needed to be trimmed regularly, their wicks snipped short with a special tool, or they would produce even more smoke, gutter unevenly, and burn through unnecessarily fast. An evening spent by tallow candlelight was not the peaceful, romantic image we might picture today. It meant sitting in a smoky, dim room, periodically stopping whatever task you were doing to tend the flame itself, simply to keep enough light in the room to continue. Making tallow candles at home was itself a grueling, unpleasant, and somewhat dangerous seasonal task that fell, like so much domestic labor of the era, primarily to women. Rendering animal fat required hours spent over a hot pot, carefully melting and straining fat skimmed from butchered animals, before repeatedly dipping wicks by hand into the molten tallow, layer after layer, waiting for each coat to cool and harden before adding the next. A single candle-making session might produce dozens or even hundreds of Candles at once, an entire household's supply for weeks or months, but the process itself could consume an entire day of exhausting, smelly, physically demanding labor, performed near an open flame with a vat of scalding hot fat, adding yet another layer of everyday domestic risk to a life that already contained no shortage of it. Beeswax candles burned cleaner, brighter, and without the offensive smell of rendered animal fat, and for this reason they were prized throughout history as a luxury item, used in wealthy households, royal courts, and religious ceremonies where the smell and smoke of tallow would have been considered deeply inappropriate. But beeswax was expensive to produce, requiring far more labor and far more raw material relative to the light it produced compared to tallow, and this expense placed it permanently out of reach for the overwhelming majority of the population. Historical account books from medieval churches and noble households reveal beeswax candles being purchased and tracked with the same careful attention given to any valuable commodity, because in a very real sense that is exactly what they were. A form of stored, portable light that could cost as much as fine cloth or imported spices, pound for pound. The sheer cost of candlelight in any form shaped daily behavior in ways that are almost invisible to us now precisely because we no longer have to think about them at all. Households across pre-industrial Europe organized their entire daily schedules around the amount of natural daylight available, working from dawn until dusk during the summer months when light was abundant, and dramatically curtailing productive activity during the long winter nights when artificial light was simply too expensive to burn for hours on end. This seasonal rhythm was not a lifestyle choice born from some deeper cultural wisdom about work-life balance. It was an economic necessity, dictated entirely by the brutal math of candle expense against household income. Historians studying pre-industrial labor patterns have found that many trades, particularly those requiring fine detail work like sewing, lace-making, or reading, effectively shut down or slowed dramatically during winter months in households that could not afford enough candlelight to work safely by, representing a very real, very consistent loss of productive and educational time that repeated itself every single year, for every single generation for centuries. Governments themselves recognized candlelight as valuable enough to tax directly, a fact that reveals just how central and how costly artificial light was considered throughout much of history. England imposed a candle tax for well over a century, beginning in the early 1700s, a levy so resented by ordinary households that it eventually became illegal for families to make their own candles at home without paying a license fee to do so, forcing the poor to either pay the tax on manufactured candles or risk fines for producing their own. This tax was not repealed until the mid-1800s, and when it finally was lifted, contemporary accounts describe it as a genuine, tangible relief for working households, comparable in the public imagination to the later repeal of taxes on tea or salt, another small but deeply felt reduction in the daily cost of simply living an ordinary life. Literacy itself was deeply entangled with this economics of light. Learning to read and, more importantly, having the leisure time and available light to actually practice reading regularly was a luxury that poorer households simply could not always afford, regardless of whether books were technically accessible to them. Diaries and letters that survive from ordinary working people across the 1700s and 1800s occasionally mention the frustration of wanting to read after a long day of labor, only to find that the household could not justify burning a candle for the purpose, reserving whatever light they could afford for tasks considered more immediately essential, like mending clothing or finishing piecework that brought in actual income. In this very real sense, darkness itself functioned as a quiet, largely unacknowledged barrier to education and literacy, one that fell hardest on exactly the families who could least afford to overcome it. The danger of these early lighting sources was every bit as serious as their expense. An open candle flame, sitting unguarded in a room often filled with straw bedding, wooden furniture, and dried textiles, represented a constant fire risk that families lived with every single night. Historical records of house fires across pre-industrial Europe repeatedly cite an overturned or unattended candle as the cause, a single small flame left burning too close to bedding or curtains while its owner drifted off to sleep, transforming an entire home into an inferno within minutes. Candles left burning near infants' cradles, a practice necess. For parents checking on sleeping children through the night appear with grim regularity in historical accounts of house fires and, tragically, in the deaths of infants themselves when a dropped or toppled candle ignited bedding within a crib. Beyond fire, there was the simple, constant danger of navigating a world that was, quite literally, mostly dark for roughly half of every 24-hour period. Streets in even the largest cities of Europe remained almost entirely unlit after dark well into the 1700s, meaning that anyone traveling at night did so either by carrying their own lantern, an expensive and often impractical solution, or by navigating essentially blind through streets that could contain open sewage channels, uneven paving, loose animals, and in many cities, genuine criminal danger that thrived specifically because darkness made witnesses and pursuit equally difficult. City records from London, Paris, and other major European centers are full of complaints, official decrees, and eventually organized night watch systems, all attempting to grapple with the basic, dangerous reality that darkness controlled the city for more hours than daylight did, and that darkness was, in every meaningful sense, lawless in a way daylight simply was not. Some cities attempted partial solutions long before true street lighting existed, requiring households to hang a lantern outside their door on certain nights, or employing link boys, young men and boys who could be hired on the spot to walk alongside a traveler carrying a torch, guiding them safely through unlit streets for a small fee. This was, in its own way, an entire small economy built around nothing more than the basic human need to see where one was walking after dark, a service that would strike anyone living in a modern, electrically lit city as almost unimaginable, and yet it persisted as an ordinary, unremarkable feature of urban life for generations, right up until street lighting finally began to spread widely enough to make it unnecessary. The 18th century brought a genuine improvement in the form of spermaceti candles, made from a waxy substance found in the head cavities of sperm whales, which burned significantly brighter, cleaner, and more consistently than tallow, without the offensive smell. This single product transformed an entire industry almost overnight, and it is difficult to overstate just how directly the demand for better household light drove one of history's most brutal and far-reaching hunts of a single species. Whaling fleets from ports across New England and Europe pursued sperm whales specifically for this substance, along with whale oil more broadly, which itself became a critical fuel for a new generation of oil lamps that burned brighter and cleaner than any candle. By the early 1800s, whale oil lamps had become the aspirational standard of household lighting for those who could afford them, a genuine improvement over centuries of dim, smoky, unreliable candlelight, purchased at an almost incalculable cost to sperm whale populations across the world's oceans, hunted to the edge of collapse specifically because human beings wanted to see clearly after dark. The scale of this industry, by the early to mid-19th century, was genuinely enormous. Entire port towns in New England, most famously Nantucket and New Bedford, built their economies almost entirely around whaling voyages that could last 2, 3, or even 4 years at a time, sending ships thousands of miles across every ocean on Earth in pursuit of a single biological resource whose primary economic value came down to a simple, unglamorous fact: it burned well in a lamp. Prices for whale oil and spermaceti candles rose steadily as whale populations in more accessible waters were depleted, forcing fleets to travel farther and stay at sea longer to maintain the same catch, an early and largely unrecognized example of a resource being consumed faster than it could naturally replenish, driven entirely by a demand that in hindsight seems almost quaint. Households simply wanted enough light to read by after the sun went down. The discovery and refinement of kerosene in the mid-1800s arrived just in time to save the sperm whale from what many historians believe would have otherwise been complete extinction, offering a cheaper, more abundant alternative derived from petroleum rather than a rapidly dwindling ocean population. Kerosene lamps spread rapidly through the second half of the 19th century, finally bringing genuinely affordable, reasonably bright artificial light within reach of a much broader swath of the population than ever before in human history. For the first time, working and middle-class families in industrializing nations could reasonably afford to light a room for several hours each evening without the crushing expense that had defined candlelight for centuries beforehand. This shift, rarely celebrated with the fanfare given to other historical milestones, quietly extended the productive, wakeful hours of an enormous portion of humanity, adding real, meaningful hours back into lives that had previously simply gone dark the moment the sun set. Gas lighting, developed and expanded through major cities beginning in the early 1800s, brought an entirely different scale of transformation, illuminating not just individual homes but entire streets, entire cities for the first time in human history. London began installing gas streetlights in the 1810s, and other major European and American cities followed over the following decades, fundamentally altering what nighttime life in a city could even look like. Streets that had been genuinely dangerous and largely abandoned after dark slowly became navigable, even social spaces. Shops began staying open later, Theaters and public entertainments extended their hours. An entire dimension of urban life, essentially unavailable for the entirety of prior human history, opened up simply because cities found a way to push back against darkness on a scale no individual household candle ever could. Contemporary observers writing in the early decades of gas street lighting described the change in almost utopian terms, marveling at the sight of entire boulevards glowing steadily through the night, crowds strolling comfortably after dark in ways that would have seemed reckless or simply impossible only a generation earlier. Crime rates in newly lit districts reportedly dropped in some cities, and municipal authorities increasingly came to view public lighting not as an occasional civic luxury, but as a basic infrastructure investment, comparable to paved roads or a clean water supply, something a modern, respectable city was simply expected to provide. Factory owners, too, seized on gaslight's potential, extending working hours into the evening in a way that reshaped industrial labor patterns, for better productivity and, quite often, for considerably worse conditions for the workers whose days grew longer simply because artificial light now made it possible to keep machines running well past sunset. And yet gaslighting brought its own very real dangers, dangers that were arguably even more severe than the fire risk of candles. Gas leaks, whether from faulty pipes, human error, or deliberate tampering, could fill enclosed rooms with an invisible, odorless, highly flammable and toxic substance, leading to explosions that could level buildings and asphyxiation deaths that claimed victims who never even realized anything was wrong before losing consciousness entirely. Historical records from the gaslighting era are dense with reports of exactly this kind of tragedy: entire families found dead in their beds from gas exposure, explosions that destroyed homes and businesses, and a growing, justified public anxiety about inviting an invisible, potentially lethal substance directly into the walls of one's own home in exchange for better light. Safety improvements, odorizing agents added specifically so leaks could be detected by smell, and stricter installation standards gradually reduced these risks over subsequent decades. But the transition from candlelight to gaslight was never the clean, purely positive story it is sometimes remembered as. The truly final, complete transformation arrived with the electric light bulb in the final decades of the 19th century, a technology that eliminated open flame from household lighting entirely, removing simultaneously the fire risk of candles, the toxic gas risk of early gas lighting, and the constant, exhausting labor of tending wicks, trimming flames, and rationing an expensive, limited resource hour by hour through every winter evening of an entire lifetime. The spread of electric lighting followed a familiar, uneven pattern, reaching wealthy urban households first in the 1880s and 90s, while rural communities in even wealthy industrialized nations sometimes waited until the 1930s, 40s, or later to receive reliable electrical service at all. A gap immortalized in government rural electrification programs that treated bringing light into the darkest corners of the countryside as a genuine matter of public policy and national development, not merely a household convenience. In the United States, this gap was significant enough that it became the target of deliberate federal action in the 1930s, when large-scale rural electrification programs were created specifically because private electric companies had found it unprofitable to run power lines out to sparsely populated farming communities, leaving millions of rural households still dependent on candles and kerosene lamps decades after city dwellers had already come to take electric light entirely for granted. Farmers and rural families who lived through this transition often described the arrival of electric light in almost reverent terms in oral histories and memoirs, recalling the specific, vivid memory of a single bulb switching on for the first time in a farmhouse kitchen, illuminating a room fully and instantly in a way that an entire lifetime of candles and lamps never quite managed to do, even at their very best. The full scale of what this transformation actually meant is almost impossible to appreciate now, precisely because it succeeded so completely. Consider that for the vast majority of human history, roughly half of every single day was functionally lost to darkness for the average family, an enormous repeating tax on human time and human potential that fell hardest on the poorest households, who could least afford to buy their way out of it with candles, oil, or gas. Consider the literacy that never developed, the trades that slowed every winter, the infants lost to overturned candles beside their cradles, the sperm whale populations hunted to the edge of extinction, all in service of a basic, fundamental human need that we now satisfy so effortlessly, so cheaply, and so completely that most people alive today have genuinely never once had to think about whether they can afford to see after dark. And even this story, like the others, has not fully finished playing out everywhere on Earth. Today, hundreds of millions of people still live without reliable access to electric light, relying instead on kerosene lamps, candles, or simple battery torches to extend their day past sunset, in regions where power grids remain unreliable, unaffordable, or simply non-existent. Public health and development researchers studying these communities have documented startlingly familiar consequences. Reduced study time for children who cannot safely read after dark, respiratory illness linked to indoor kerosene fumes, and a very real measurable economic cost that comes from losing hours of potential productive time every single evening. The exact same pattern that defined life in that English farmhouse in 1673, still repeating itself in households on the other side of the modern world, separated by more than 3 centuries, and yet bound by the same basic ancient constraint. That family in their English farmhouse in December of 1673, sitting in darkness for 14 hours because a single candle cost half a day's wages, were not living some unusual, unfortunate exception to ordinary human experience. They were living the ordinary, universal condition of nearly every human being who had ever existed before them, and of most human beings who would continue to exist for another 2 centuries afterward. Darkness was not simply the absence of light. It was, for the vast majority of human history, an active, expensive, dangerous force that shaped when people worked, what they learned, how safely they moved through their own cities, and how many productive, wakeful hours they were ever actually permitted to have. The next time you walk into a dark room and flip a switch without a single conscious thought, consider what that small, instantaneous, essentially free convenience actually represents. It represents the quiet, complete unraveling of one of the oldest and most fundamental constraints ever placed on human life, a tax on time itself that was paid night after night for the entire span of recorded history, until it simply quietly stopped being paid at all.